Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Protecting Your Legacy through Conservation-Based Estate Planning webinar series. Appreciate you taking the time. My name is Paul Catanzaro, and I'm a professor at UMass. And I also want to introduce Guthrie Diamond, who has been instrumental in helping to organize this and follow up with you and give you great information and resources after the webinar. So we're welcome. We're very thrilled that you were able to join us this evening. Want to just thank our sponsor, DCR, the Bureau of Forestry Service Forestry Program, through their Forest Work Initiative. The Bureau of Forestry recognizes all of the immense myriad of benefits that come from forests, and in Massachusetts and across the eastern U.S., those benefits are largely off of family forests. And so DCR in Massachusetts provides us some funding and has for the last 10 to 12 years to provide resources and programs to family forest owners to help you make decisions that hopefully meet your personal and financial goals, but also in doing so, help protect all of those and sustain all of those wonderful forest benefits. So we thank them for their support of this work. This is the third in our webinar series here. We're 3 of 4. We did record both of the first 2 webinars, so we have that on Mass Woods. You can go to that web page that's listed. And also, Guthrie did send that out in her announcement, so you can get those recordings there. And we will also send another email after this webinar as well. So this is our third webinar in our series, and the next webinar will be in 2 weeks, and we will be, we're trying something different. We're trying something new. We want to talk to, or at least try to answer the questions of those that might be inheriting the land or buying land from you or from other landowners. And so we're going to be having our webinar focused on becoming a landowner to help with those transition and challenges, again, in the hopes that people will keep their land forested and enjoy it for all the great personal benefits it provides as well. Just a reminder that there are lots of people on here from different states, as you saw in the chat when we started introducing ourselves, which is fantastic news. Most of the information that Olivia will be providing you this evening is spot on for your state. There are, however, some nuances, and we will try to point that out as they arise. Perhaps maybe the first obvious one is in Massachusetts, we call one of the tools that Olivia will talk about a conservation restriction. But I think we're the only state in the country that does that. Most other states call it a conservation easement. So we might use those interchangeably, but they're the same tool. Where there are questions or where there might be differences, we'll encourage you to reach out maybe to some local resources. And as always, and some people have taken me up on this, and I'm grateful they did. Feel free to reach out to me, and I've been able to connect people in a couple of different states with their local land trusts and resource professionals to help them with their decisions. So take me up on it. Feel free to reach out. So we've been working on this paradigm, this boiling it all down, 2 important questions, future ownership and future use. And tonight we're going to be talking about this piece here. If you would like to, in terms of reaching your personal goals of maybe keeping some or all of your land forested or in its natural state, we're going to be talking about, or Olivia is going to be talking about, tools to do that. You can do that both temporarily, but also permanently. And so if you are interested in the temporary or a temporary option of keeping your land in its natural state, then I would encourage you to look at your state's current use program in Massachusetts. That's called the Chapter 61 program. And we have a recorded webinar of a service forester that it's explaining that. So that's on the Masswoods page as well. But tonight, what we're going to be talking about specifically is keeping your land, some or all of your land, undeveloped in its natural state permanently. And our friend Olivia is going to walk us through that. Olivia is the Crichton Land Conservation Specialist For the trustees of reservation, she also has a bachelor's and undergraduate degree in forestry. I'm very proud of that, or like to see that. And she's going to talk to us about what it is to work with landowners and help them achieve their goals, and what tools you can use and how you can find and identify partners to do that. So with that, I am going to stop my share, Olivia, and hand
Great.
it over to you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. And I'm going to do my transition to screen sharing. Um, as we're having folks log on, I was saying to Paul and Guthrie, it's fun to know that there's some familiar faces in the audience and some new folks as well. And I think this is really one of the first years that there's such a wide geographic spread. So no matter what corner of the globe you're tuning in from, thank you for being here. And I hope we can get some new information or hear it in a new way this evening. So this can build a little bit on what Paul was just talking about, but there's many different ways we can think about the future of your lands. And whether you want to think about something that's more on the permanent side, we're going to talk a lot about that tonight, and also about that temporary side. So, Paul really first started off this webinar series talking about conservation-based estate planning. As he mentioned, the current use program, Chapter 61 in Massachusetts. These are all great ways to get the ball rolling and thinking about land conservation or just land use. But if you're really ready to think about these permanent options, seeing your land protected forever, there are a number of tools that we can use for you. So we're going to focus on the left side of the screen tonight. I'm mostly going to dig into what's called fee ownership and conservation restrictions. Again, if you're not in Massachusetts, you'll hear those as conservation easements. But I did also want to mention agricultural preservation restrictions as well. So we'll hear a little bit more about that later on. But before we even can get to those tools, I think it's really important to understand that when we do these types of conservation deals, when we get to a conservation outcome, it really involves these two players or these two teams. So many of you are representing the first category here tonight, which is a willing landowner. It's so amazing to have you just be listening in on this webinar series and gaining information. I hope many of you do take the step to protect your land. But we really need folks like you wanting to see their lands protected, keep them in forests, keep them in active ag. And so you're really the first player on this list. And the second one is also finding a legitimate conservation organization to work with. And this is really important. Those folks have a big job to fill as well. They're really looking at the conservation value of your land. They're potentially offering some tax benefits for you as a charitable deduction. They're either owning the land or holding a conservation
Yeah,
restriction or
get off this
conservation
meeting.
easement. And then we'll talk about this a little bit, but if a CR is donated or sold to a conservation organization, they have this long-term monitoring requirement as well. And so we have these two teams here. You all know yourselves pretty well, but you might not know those other folks. And when we start wading into these conversations, reminder that oftentimes these are real estate transactions and we're dealing with our legal system. And so sometimes we can have these not so everyday terms come up. And so I wanted to do just a brief terminology thing. I'm not going to go super into it, but wanted to familiarize you all with two terms. When we start to get into legal transactions, you all as private landowners, willing landowners, are referred to as the grantor. And then folks on my side representing conservation organizations, those organizations are referred to as the grantee. And so anytime you start to see some of this legalese, these legal wordings, it can always be great to kind of pause and take a step back, ask someone who might know these answers, and just make sure you're not getting too overwhelmed by simple terminology, which ultimately is referring to our two players here. Now, before we get into these tools, I also wanted to talk about those different conservation organizations in general, when thinking about who you might want to work with to see your land protected. You have a lot of different options, and it's really about finding the right fit and finding a good match between those two players. So if you can see how I've maybe organized the slide here, on the left side of your screen, you'll see a lot of emblems or logos for public conservation organizations. On the first column, we have federal conservation organizations. In that more right column, but still on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Massachusetts state conservation organizations. And then on the other side of the screen, you'll see these private conservation organizations. And again, similar to the federal versus state versus even municipal level, we also have conservation organizations operating at different scales on the private sector as well. You have people like the Nature Conservancy who work all over the world. You have the trustees of reservations in Mass Audubon who work all across a singular state. And then you have more regional or maybe even specific town-based conservation organizations. And each of these entities really have mission statements, goals, current strategic plans that they're working on. So it's important for you to find an organization that you feel comfortable working with. Maybe you're really excited to work with a public entity, or maybe you really want to work with a private entity. You know, those are good conversations for you to have with other decision makers in your land holdings. But know that these folks will also be trying to make the right match as well and make sure they're taking on a project that really aligns with their organization, their mission, and how they protect land. This is a little bit of an overwhelming map, but I love it. I'm super proud of Massachusetts and the amazing conservation community that it has. This just shows you how many options you have across the state. This is a map I put together a couple years ago and trying to just understand who was working in different parts of the state. And so, you know, we'll definitely make sure you have this map if you want. Paul at the end of my presentation is going to talk about how you could get contact information for these different folks. But again, looking at this map, we have these cross-hatching of singular towns, and then you have these organizations that are working on the whole statewide level. So there's lots of people you can get in contact with. And if you get in contact with someone and it's not quite the right fit, we're always happy to pass you along to one of our colleagues. So I wanted to mention that just because this is an important relationship to build as you think about some of these land protection tools. Another really foundational element for us to talk about tonight is all of the rights that you all have as landowners. And so every piece of land has a number of rights associated with it. And oftentimes they're sold all together. So when you buy a house, it's like, great, you bought the house, you bought the land with it, and you bought all these other potential rights. Some of them, an example on the screen, would be like the residential or commercial development, mining rights, maybe there's some minerals underneath the surface, water rights, being able to do agricultural forestry on the land, and then also how you could use or access the land as well. So usually those are bought or sold or transferred all collectively, and we often refer to this as a bundle of sticks. All of those rights are grouped together and they're being transferred from one entity to the next. But importantly, that bundle can be taken apart a bit. You can have those individual sticks that make up all of those rights be granted to or gifted to or sold to a different entity. So some things I come up against a lot would be potentially you have like a power line or a gas line across your property. Someone else has one of those sticks that's part of your land that's allowing them to access it or have that pipeline or transmission line across your property.
All of a sudden,
And so, you know, we can
shows
think
up.
about this not only in maybe what feels like an overwhelming, I have a larger piece of land, but for a lot of folks that are also homeowners, it can be nice to kind of translate this language and these concepts to what you've already had a lot of experience with. So now we're going to finally jump into it a little bit more. The first one we're going to talk about is what we call fee ownership. And so this is that simplest form of land protection. We are taking that whole bundle of rights and we are transferring it from you, a willing landowner, to a conservation organization. And so this is where I talked about finding an organization that has a mission you believe in, is really important because ultimately that land is being protected through the organization's mission. So, for example, if you're someone who really cares about maybe animal rights and doesn't believe in hunting, it might not make sense to work with a conservation organization that allows hunting on your lands, because that might be something that the future use of your land is allowed for public access. So we're really thinking about making that match so that when that whole bundle of sticks is passed from you or your family or ownership entity to a conservation organization, you feel really good about how it will be protected and stewarded in the future. And I also wanted to just point out that that transfer also comes with the rights and obligations associated with ownership. So when a conservation organization takes on that fee ownership, they're going to be stewarding it and managing it. They're likely going to be making sure no one's trespassing on it, encroaching on it. And again, depending on their mission and what they do, perhaps they're going to be actively farming it. Perhaps they're going to be doing some ecological management to it. But it's really theirs to have in their portfolio and to protect. The phrase that we use is in perpetuity, into forever. Now, there's a couple ways that you can do this. You can sell your property to a conservation organization at the fair market value, so it's true cost. You could donate that property to a conservation organization, or you could do what we call a bargain sale. And that is where it is a percentage of that fair market value. So let's say, I always use really round numbers to just make things up, but let's say you have 100 acres of land and it's valued at $100,000. For whatever reason, you don't feel like you need $100,000 or potentially you want to get some tax benefits of it, you might decide to sell that property to a conservation organization at $50,000, and that would be considered a bargain sale. That conservation organization is getting a bargain for that property. And this is where a lot of times we try to meet in the middle between a landowner's financial needs and also desire to see their property protected, potentially the background of their taxes or their estate or their income tax. And so we're always trying to find a way that makes the most sense, not only for the conservation organization, but also for the landowner. So that's pretty simple. That's like mostly what I'm going to talk about with fee ownership. It is simply transferring that whole bundle of rights from you to a conservation entity, selling it, donating it, having a bargain sale. Now, when we get into conservation restrictions, it gets a little bit more tricky because we are essentially starting to take apart that bundle of rights. So a conservation restriction, or again, if you're not in Massachusetts, a conservation easement is a legal agreement that permanently limits the uses and activities on that land. So essentially, the conservation organization is removing some of those rights and holding on to them from your bundle of sticks in order to protect the conservation values of the land. You know, what's really unique about this, as opposed to in fee ownership, where you and your family might decide, you know, we've held on to this land for a really long time, but you know, most folks have moved away, or we're just not interested in managing this anymore. We want to just fully have the property protected and stewarded by another entity. In a conservation restriction scenario, you can still maintain the ownership of your land. You could continue to live on your land. You could continue to use your land, but you have the rest assurance that it is being protected in perpetuity forever. And these certain uses, oftentimes development and mining, are not going to happen on the land. And I say in perpetuity because when you have this type of legal document, the conservation restriction runs with the land. So that means even if you were to transfer your property to a totally another random landowner, that conservation restriction still exists. And a relationship is formed between that new landowner and the conservation organization that you first put the conservation restriction on your land with. So even if you were to pass away, even if you were to sell your property, it is going to remain protected in perpetuity. Now, when you are still living on this land, the conservation organization is also not living there with you. So they need to make sure that those conservation values are still being protected. So you're going to still have an ongoing relationship with this conservation organization. It is that organization's duty to come and monitor the land each year. So you're going to be getting in contact with them. They're going to come likely walk the land or maybe do some remote monitoring using aerial imagery to make sure that everything looks in order, that there isn't any building that's not supposed to be happening, that maybe a neighbor isn't encroaching on the property, and that all of the values, the conservation values that were outlined when the conservation restriction was first put in place, are still there over time. So I really love working with the conservation restriction landowners that we have at the trustees. It's one of my favorite parts of my job where I get to go and visit with them each year, hear about what's going on in their life, see the changes in their landscape. Because for so many landowners, they have such amazing stories on their land, and this is such an opportunity for me to intersect with them and get to know them and their property a little bit better. Well, and what's great about the early stages of this permanent protection tool, the conservation restriction, is that it's really a conversation and a negotiation between the landowner and the conservation organization. Each conservation restriction is unique. There is a state model in Massachusetts that most entities use, that a lot of it is boilerplate legalese. But then the actual conservation values and actual allowed uses of the land really change depending on the parameters that the land has. Like, is it on a lake? Is it forested? Is it all ag fields? Is there amazing rare species habitat? Is there already a house there? There's so many variations in land that it really takes getting to know the landowners and the property itself in order to be in this drafting stage of a conservation restriction. Another really wonderful aspect of conservation restrictions is they're pretty flexible in terms of how much land you want to cover. So in this map over here, we have a property outlined in yellow. And in this example, we have a building envelope outlined in blue. And so this is something where that whole yellow parcel is protected under the conservation restriction, but this building envelope in the middle is going to allow for some potential future development. It's spelled out, it can only be one single residential house. It can't be a whole parking lot, or I know I saw someone in the comments write something about a data center or a shopping mall. But it still allows for some development for that landowner to have some flexibility. But that is being constrained by the conservation restriction. So you can either have a building envelope within a conservation restriction, or if you know that you want to maybe like build on the road frontage, you could just exclude your existing house or a future house site or development site from the conservation restriction. So again, if you have 100 acres, you could put a conservation restriction over that a whole 100 acres, or it might make the most amount of sense to just put it over 80 or 90 of that acres. Now, another thing that I want to point out is that, again, since these documents are unique to the land and they do need to be negotiated and drafted together, putting a conservation restriction on your property definitely does take some time. And specifically in Massachusetts, our conservation restrictions are reviewed by the state, by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And this is unique to Massachusetts. So if you're not in Massachusetts, it might look a little bit different. But once our two key players, our willing landowner and our conservation organization, have drafted a conservation restriction that makes sense for them, they then send that draft off to the state for their review. And they're ensuring that the conservation restriction is protecting conservation values. And they also have another set of legal eyes on it to make sure that there aren't any mistakes or errors or contradictions in a document that, again, is going to be around forever. It is nearly impossible to extinguish a conservation restriction. There is a potential to amend a conservation restriction in the future, but that is also pretty challenging. And it must maintain the conservation values. You couldn't be like, oh, it's been 50 years, never mind. We actually want to take like 50 acres out of that conservation restriction, the amendment really needs to show that there's a specific reason that you're amending that property, and the state is also going to review it to ensure the longevity of those conservation values. And that also takes a little bit of time. I do think it's really worthwhile. The state provides a really helpful review, but just know as you're thinking about timelines of how you might want to move forward, that conservation restriction review definitely does add some extra steps as you move forward. Now, just like fee ownership, a conservation restriction can be purchased at fair market value by that conservation organization. You can donate a conservation restriction to a conservation organization, and you can also have a bargain sale. It just gets a little bit tricky because remember, you're still holding on to a good percentage of that bundle of sticks. And now that landowner or that conservation organization has a few of those bundle of sticks. And so the appraisal process for a conservation restriction just looks a little bit different and actually takes the difference between the full fair market value, which often has development value with it, and subtracts the value of what the land is worth once the conservation restriction is in place, and you get left with the value. So it's not going to be the same full value as if you were to sell or donate fee ownership or fee entity, but it is a percentage of that full fair market value of the property. Now, I did say I'd talk about agricultural preservation restrictions. A lot of parts of Massachusetts and other parts of the country have farmland that is incredibly important to remain protected and available for farming. And so we have a slightly different tool, which is an agricultural preservation restriction or an APR. A CR and an APR can look really similar. It is also a permanent legal document restricting the use of their land, but the APR goes one step further. It's really focusing on that agricultural value of land, and in our current day, we're often adding extra provisions that are requiring things like making sure that that land is in active agriculture into the future. So you couldn't just let lands go fallow. You need to have someone farming that land. It might be helping restrict the cost of that property in the future so it maintains its lower cost for farmers in order to purchase land or live on the land and be farming the land. So it is a little bit more restrictive. You can have an APR with a private conservation partner, like one of those land trusts, but in Massachusetts in particular, a lot of the times our agricultural preservation restrictions are with our Mass Department of Ag Resources, and so you'll have a public partner. What's great about working with MDAR is they have funding in order to purchase agricultural preservation restrictions, and it's really their bread and butter. And so they're doing this kind of all day, looking at prime soils, looking at field viability, and making sure that an APR is the right tool for that land. Now, I don't want to confuse anyone because in a CR, you can absolutely still have farmland encompassed in that. It just maybe is less strict around the uses of that land. So a CR might be ag friendly and allow for agricultural uses, but it might not require that that land be maintained in active agriculture. So that's why I kind of put this as a subcategory. There's a lot of similarities, but if you are a farmer or have a lot of farmland, this could be a great tool to look into. And again, there's often some great funding through those public conservation partners for ag lands in particular. All right, so we talked about an overview of just those tools on the permanent side. If you remember back to my opening slide, we looked at those three tools on that permanent side. And the one thing that we've kind of left out so far have been deed restrictions. This might be something you've heard about before. Deed restrictions have a place, don't get me wrong, but they're not a permanent solution. There is a reason we put them on the temporary side of that spectrum. The way they are in Massachusetts, at least, it is a different section of Mass General Law than our conservation restriction guiding legal documents. And so they look a little bit different. Instead of being in perpetuity, they have more of a term to them. They cannot be enforced for more than 30 years unless a longer period is specifically stated. So you might have a deed restriction that says like 100 years or 200 years. But even so, the way Mass General Law works is even if a longer term is stated, the restriction must be periodically re-recorded. So in Massachusetts, you hit 30 years, there needs to be a document that goes back in the registry of deeds that says, we still want this deed restriction, we're extending it. And then it has to be re-recorded every 20 years. And so that's just a lot of like background um, work that needs to be done. It's totally possible that you might miss that deadline and then that deed restriction goes away. It's also a little bit more challenging to enforce these. They come up in court more often, and we've seen them be challenged specifically in Massachusetts courts. So they definitely have a role. Perhaps you want to like try out restricting your land a little bit before you go the full conservation restriction route. Potentially you're not going to get like approvals from a municipality or the state's not going to approve that full-on conservation restriction, but you still want to see some level of restriction on the property. Or the other thing about deed restrictions is that there needs to be a benefited party. And so if there's no benefited party, it's again like a little bit trickier to have them be enforceable. And so definitely something you could look at with an attorney if you wanted to. But if you're really thinking about permanent land protection, I don't want to see my land change its current land use. I want to see it protected. I want to see it forested, ag forever. Deed restriction doesn't quite give you that assurance. I've mentioned also a couple times about this donation piece or this bargain sale piece, and you might say like, that's amazing. I would love to be able to have my land or a CR go to a conservation organization, but I don't know if I can just afford that. You know, land has financial weight to it. You might be relying on that to send your kids to college or pay for medical expenses in the future. And so, you know, fully just the idea of like giving something away might be hard to contemplate. The government and the IRS has also thought about that, and they really want to benefit landowners in engaging in permanent conservation options through potential tax benefits. And so when we look at the donation of land, the donation of a CR or APR, or some of those bargain sales, we're really looking at the gifts and charitable contributions regulations of the IRS. Now, it's important that that value of the donation is going to need to be determined by a third-party appraisal, so that the IRS can be assured, you know, you donated $100,000 worth of property, you're going to receive that federal income tax deduction, or maybe look at reducing the estate taxes or offsetting capital gains tax. This may seem really high level. I always have to give the caveat that I am not a tax professional. And so, although I can plant some seeds here, I do really encourage you to reach out to an attorney or a tax professional that could really walk through the specifics of your property and the potential tax benefits that might be available to you if you were to seek donation or a bargain sale of an interest in your land. I'm going to pause for a second there because that was a lot of information. Because now we're going to take this into like kind of a 201 or this application of the land protection tools. So we know about fee ownership, we know about conservation restrictions and agricultural preservation restrictions. But the other thing, and Paul and Guthrie and I were talking about this before the call, is it's all about timing. You know, you need to figure out what makes the most amount of sense with your family, with your spouse, with other decision makers of what does the future of my land look like, not only in the long term, but you know, when does it make sense to really engage with some of these tools? It could be you're ready to sell or donate an interest in your land right now, but you also might continue to want to use or live on your land for quite a long time. And so we've really thought of some ways to apply these tools in order to meet folks' needs. The first one I'll start with is a bequest, and this is building a little bit off of your last webinar session that you had about wills and trusts. But you can absolutely specify a donation of land or a CR through a will. You could put that in your will. And the great thing is that wills can change over time. You could put that in your will now and say, I want to donate my 100 acres of land to the land trust in my area. And if something were to happen, if all of a sudden you needed to access the value of that property and maybe sell off a house lot or the entirety, you're always allowed to change that will. And so this last bullet point here, you'll see it's a really great approach if you need to keep that financial value in reserve. But you still know that, once you were to pass away, I know my land is going to be protected and either the full fee ownership or conservation restriction is going to be conveyed to that conservation organization through my estate. Again, it does not become effective until your death. So you can make the decision now, but you have a little bit of time to then change your mind if need be. What's really crucial as someone that works at a conservation organization is if you're thinking about this, we would love to talk to you before you go ahead and just put us in your will and then don't tell us about it. And then hopefully in many years and after you've lived a long, full life, you pass away. And then all of a sudden I get an email from your estate attorney that says, Mrs. Smith is really excited. She's leaving you her 100 acres. Just like I've said before, we want to make sure that the conservation organization you want to work with is a good fit. You might also have some other stewardship wishes or desires. There might be some other decisions that need to be worked out ahead of time. And we really want to talk to you about that while we have the opportunity to, while you're alive, to again have those conversations now, understand your wishes and desires. And if the first organization you reach out to isn't a good fit, have you actually find a conservation organization that will be protecting your land or a conservation restriction on your land for the long term. But I love working with landowners in this way. It allows them to continue to use and live on their property, but they know that it'll be protected and added to the larger open space network in the future. Another great tool is something called a reserved life estate. And this also allows individuals to continue to live on their properties. However, you are already selling or gifting the property while you are alive, but reserving that right to occupy and use the property. Usually these come with an additional agreement document where the conservation organization and the landowner work out some of the details. But when I've worked on these before, it's pretty common that agreement will say, great, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you're going to continue to live on this property. You have actually transferred the deed over to the conservation organization. But while you're still living there and while you're still alive, you're going to be responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the property. You're still going to be responsible for utilities and taxes, but you know that that transaction has already happened. It is actually already owned by that conservation organization. And again, if you go the donation route, that gift of property can qualify the donor for charitable deduction on federal income taxes. It just looks a little bit different because you're still maintaining that right to live on the property. And so there's actually a calculation table based on age and predicted age of death and value of property. So it's not going to be quite the same value if you were to just fully donate the property without continuing to live on it. But there's still this opportunity to have some tax benefits while still being able to live on or enjoy your land during your lifetime. Now, maybe the most fun one is what we call limited development, but it's really all about these puzzle pieces. And so this is where we look at a larger piece of land and we think about what your needs are and what makes the most sense for a property. So this graphic you see on the left side of the screen is actually from the Protecting Your Legacy informational booklet that I think Paul has mentioned before, and Guthrie's probably sent out the link to, but this just shows an example of how you could think about using multiple of these tools together to meet your needs. So you could potentially keep fee ownership over part of your land, but have a CR be part of it. You could again like leave some house lots out of a CR or retain them in your ownership so that future children or grandchildren could, sell off those house lots in order to have some financial contributions to their funds. You could continue to live on a property. We're looking about all the different ways that you might be able to put together a deal that makes sense for you and aligns with your goals. Ideally, when this is done well, the land with the highest conservation value is the one being protected. So if you're like, I really want to maintain a house lot, it's great if that isn't in the middle of that ag field with prime farmland soils or isn't in a corridor of rare species habitat, but maybe the most like side part of a property on road frontage that's already next to a lot of houses, or just trying to find ways to minimize that conservation impact while still being able to have some of that limited development. So that is the application of some of those main tools. One piece that I also wanted to mention is there are many other easements and agreements you might hear about in the conservation world, and I wanted to just mention two of them really quickly. Another version of conservation restrictions are this idea of forever wild conservation easements. I have the Northeast Wilderness Trust's logo up here. They're the ones that in the Northeast part of the US is really doing this. It is similar to a CR, except for that it is really looking at this forever wild designation. And so if you are someone that really doesn't want to see a lot of active management of a property, but really want to just allow land to take its course and be left alone and forever wild, there are these more kind of restrictive versions of conservation easements or conservation restrictions, and a Northeast Wilderness Trust could be a great place to start and talk with them. And then a newer tool that we're adding to our toolkit is thinking about land access as well. And so there's an amazing organization that's based on the Cape Cod in Massachusetts called the Native Land Conservancy. And they are an Indigenous-led land trust. And they're really thinking about how Indigenous tribal members can have access to land for cultural use. And so they have a different in perpetuity agreement or easement that allows for access by tribal members to land for cultural uses. So we can start to get really creative. It all comes down to your goals. I'm going to bring this slide up again right here. When you're working with a conservation organization and you reach out to us, some of the first things that we're going to ask you about is that question of future use and that question of future ownership. So this is what Paul started with that great boiling it all down slide. If you don't quite have the answers to these questions yet, I recommend, if you haven't already watched the first and second webinar, going back and doing that. But I also want to stress you don't have to know all of the answers when you reach out to us. We want to talk with you. We want to brainstorm. We want to help kind of tease apart well, maybe we don't want to get in your family dynamics, but understand all the different decision makers, understand what really you love about your property so that we can start to really solidify some of these goals and these thoughts around future use and future ownership. Don't feel like you need to go to a conservation organization and say, I know exactly like what I want on this land and it's a conservation restriction with these uses. Like, that's okay. That's why we're here to talk through this with you. But if you have some idea, it's definitely really helpful. And then when you actually start talking with us, we really want to get to know you. And so I love this little phrase here, getting from conversation to conservation. It might start with attending some of these webinars. It might start with having conversations with the other decision makers of the piece of land that you own about what really does make sense for us. When does it make sense for us to do that? And for us, when you reach out to us, we really want to build a relationship with you. We see this as a huge amount of trust that you are showing in engaging with us and asking for help with this really important and really personal decision. And then once we've developed a little bit of that relationship, then we can actually get into that deal structure. How much exactly are we going to sell the property for? Is it a full market sale or a bargain sale, or is it a donation? Are we talking about a fee interest in the property? Are we talking about a CR? Are we talking about some combination of the two? We really start to get into the nitty-gritty there. And then I think what's important for folks to understand is that as a conservation organization, we always have to look at these opportunities that we're presented with as a little bit of a risk assessment. And so these are real estate transactions. We'll be taking on a real interest in property, whether that's the full fee ownership or holding a conservation restriction. And therefore, we need to do our own due diligence in the process. And so this can take a little bit of time as well. Some of the words that you'll hear professionals like myself talk about is doing a title report. That means we're looking at the chain of title and making sure we really understand who owns the property. And if, you who we're talking to is just the full decision maker or maybe one of five decision makers, and we want to know that we're talking to all the right people. So we're looking at that chain of title, making sure that there aren't any tax liens or easements that we should be aware of. We're also looking at surveys. We're looking at plans on record, surveys on record, because if we're going to take on and manage and steward an interest in land, we need to know exactly how much land we're talking about. Is it 100 acres or is it 105.4 plus or minus acres? Where exactly are those boundaries? Do they go right up against to another house lot, or do they go up against conservation land that we already know? Or we already own. And so a lot of times great surveys exist already in the registry of deeds, but sometimes we need to ask another professional for help and get a new survey done. And then another piece that we always do is looking at the environmental site conditions or doing an environmental site assessment. So again, we're doing that risk analysis. We want to work with you, but we want to make sure we're not putting ourselves at risk. So that usually involves, just making sure there isn't any contamination, or if there is anything that looks a little bit risky on site, that it's getting cleaned up. And so this all happens in this due diligence period. And as you're working with conservation organizations, it'll be important to understand what of that due diligence work the conservation organization is going to pay for, what you might be asked to pay for, or some combination. Because again, that reminder at the bottom, these are real estate transactions. So you'll likely want to have some professionals that you have to represent you. The most common would be an attorney to represent you at the closing. So when that deed actually gets transferred from you to a conservation organization, or that CR gets recorded and you're granting that conservation restriction to a conservation organization, it's important that you have legal representation. And they might be super minor or they might be more involved a little bit depending on the complexity of the project. So super quick snapshot there of how involved these deals can be. We want to make sure we're guiding you every step of the way. And sometimes it happens really fast. You're ready to have it move forward and it happens over the course of, a year. And sometimes we have landowners that we've been talking to for 5, 6, 7, 10 plus years that have a little check-in with us and say, oh, we still want to work with you at the trustees, but we're not quite ready. And we say, that's fine. We'll save your files and you can come back to us when you're ready. And so, it's all about this relationship. It's about this balance. It's about finding the right match, and making sure that you feel heard, your goals are being met, and that you're really working with someone that you want to work with. The last slide I have before I'm going to pass it back to Paul is just a reminder. There isn't a right solution, a right answer to this. It's going to be highly specific to you, your family, where you are in life, where your land is. But what's really fun about my job is land lends itself to really creative solutions. And so we can start to figure out how to put all those puzzle pieces together to find a way that feels really good for you and other family members, to have permanent land conservation if that is something that you're seeking. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides. I know Paul has a couple slides that he wants to show in terms of where you can find some of these tools. And then I think we have a good amount of time for some Q&A, and I'm super excited to talk to you all about that. So I'm going to stop my screen. And also, while Paul is sharing his screen, I can look at all the things that have come through in the chat.
Yes, there are. Well, first of all, thank you, Olivia. That was excellent. And there are more than a couple. There are a number of questions that I can help facilitate. I just wanted
Great.
to, just in terms of this has been one of the themes for those of you that have been with us for the last few webinars or even over the course of the last year or two, moving to action. Like, what are those concrete steps you can take when you leave here tonight if this is something you're interested in pursuing? How do what's a step you can take? So you could just learn more about these tools. And I put in the pages and protecting your legacy pages. I think it's 19 through 21, where there's short descriptions of these. So you can learn more about that. Mass Woods, and I'm going to show some screen grabs of some resources on my website that you can go on and check out. Um, Reach out to your local land protection specialist and start having some conversation, or talk to a neighbor with experience. Talk to someone that's been through this process and find out what went well, find out what they might do again, find out how they engage with the process. You can just immediately start having a conversation with your local conservation organization. Olivia's had a great slide showing there are a number of public and private. Some landowners feel more comfortable to working with a state agency. Others want to work with their town, and still others are interested in working with an NGO. So there are a number of organizations and people working in your community that are willing to help and want to help you, or just start moving forward. If this is something you've been thinking about, you can learn your options and start working through the process as Olivia described. I just wanted to show you a couple things on Mass Woods. So this is the home page or the top of it. And right here, right at the top is this Find a Local Contact tool. You can click on the middle one, which will give you resources and professionals in your community, if you're in Massachusetts, that can help you with these decisions about the future of your land. So your local land trust, and I put in Chesterfield because I live in Chesterfield, Mass, and up pops the local land trust, the Hilltown Land Trust, and then all the statewide land trusts. So whatever town you put in will be distinct or specific, tailored to your community. And then the public conservation organizations also show up as you scroll down the page. In this particular case, Peter Milanese works for Mass Wildlife. Nick Rossi, DCR, they cover my town of Chesterfield. And as you keep scrolling down, you can find lists for estate planning attorneys, certified public accountants, appraisers that have conservation value. I may have showed this on our first webinar as well, but just wanted to remind you, if the challenge is or what's stopping you is finding a local professional, there's a tool for that. We got you covered, so to speak. There is, as you scroll down the main page of Mass Woods, a section on planning the future of your land. So you can get information on setting your goals or what the different estate planning professionals do, what the conservation options are, information about Chapter 61. There's also a quick whiteboard video we developed. It's also important to remember that when we talked in that first webinar, we talked about conservation-based estate planning or estate planning in general being a combination of tools and documents. And so a conservation restriction, a will, Chapter 61, these are all a la carte tools that can be used together in a combination that meets your personal and financial goals. So current use can be paired with a conservation restriction, and certainly paired with things like a trust or a will. So it's a matter of finding the right combination of tools and documents that meet your needs personally and professionally. Of course, we've talked a lot about this. I know Guthrie has sent out links to this. If you want a hard copy or multiple, just let us know. We'll get those in the mail for you. And with that, I want to remind us that we have our tradition is to stop the recording so that we can have an open discussion if you wanted to ask any questions and didn't want it recorded.